9. Recognizing New Challenges, 1991-1994. It was a Friday afternoon in May 1991, and I found myself in the Pentagon with an hour free. How could I best use the time? Paul Wolfowitz was number 3 in the Pentagon, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. He'd come out to Fort Irwin in early January to observe our new training methods, and we'd driven around the desert together. We talked about national strategy and invited me to drop by and see him when I came through Washington. Because of my previous work for General Haig, we seemed to know a lot of the same people. I found the big wide stairs and navigated my way to his third-floor office. "Hi," his assistant said to me. "I'm Scooter Libby. Paul will see you now," and he opened the door and led me in. A little distracted, Wolfowitz looked up. "Congratulations on the war, Mr. Secretary," I picked up. "You must feel really good about the way it's all worked out." Saddam's forces had been pushed out of Kuwait, American casualties were light, our troops were coming home, and there was tremendous public support for our action. "Hi, Wes. Well, thanks, but not really. We screwed up and left Saddam in power," he said. "The president believes he'll be overthrown by his own people, but I rather doubt it." I'd read about this kind of criticism, but I was out in the real army and out of the loop in these kinds of discussions. I listened intently. "But we did learn one thing that's very important," Wolfowitz continued. "With the end of the Cold War, we can now use our military with impunity. The Soviets won't come in to block us, and we've got 5, maybe 10 years to clean up these old Soviet surrogate regimes like Iraq and Syria before the next superpower emerges to challenge us." I tried to engage a little. "You mean China? We'd have to act that rapidly?" "Maybe. We could have a little more time, but no one really knows." The conversation drifted off into pleasantries, and I excused myself. But the discussion lingered in my mind. The Cold War. Was it really over? A new U.S. strategy? The use of force? More missions in the Middle East? I had a lot of questions, but I didn't have any answers. Then I returned to the high desert and continued training troops for a few more months. I could put aside those questions. Others did not. On the other side of Europe, one of those who was quick to recognize new possibilities was Serbian strongman Slobodan Milosevic. A brilliant functionary inside Tito's Yugoslav Communist Party, Milosevic was an English-speaking lawyer who, by his early 30s, was managing one of Yugoslavia's largest industrial conglomerates. He then moved steadily up the ranks, and with Tito's death in 1980, had gradually positioned himself as one of the leaders in post-Tito Yugoslavia. As a Serb, he was a member of the nation's largest ethnic group, the one that dominated the military and government, and he found himself able to heighten his power and influence by accentuating the historic animosities between Yugoslav ethnic groups. Without the threat of a Soviet takeover, or of an intervention by Tito's strong hand, factional forces, envies, rivalries, and even naked hatred began to build. On June 28, 1989, Milosevic rallied nearly 1 million of his followers in a large field in Kosovo to commemorate the 600th anniversary of one of the great Serb tragedies. Though the historical accounts differ, on June 28, 1389, at the Field of Blackbirds, or Kosovo Polja, Serbian forces had been defeated by those of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. The defeat led to centuries of Turkish occupation of the land and oppression of the Serbian people. Although Kosovo was once a center of Serbian culture, this largely rural area was gradually populated hundreds of years ago by Albanians, a people who speak an entirely different language and had been converted over time to Islam. The reaction of most Serbs as the Albanian population mushroomed was to move north into more urbanized areas, thus abandoning Kosovo to the Albanians. And although it's true that Albanians make up some 90% of the population of Kosovo, that region remains a raw nerve to many Serbs, who compare their relationship with Kosovo to the relationship of Jews to Jerusalem. Those present on June 28, 1989, say that when Milosevic took the stage, his voice boomed out in an apparently impromptu rhetoric, delivering a strongly pro-Serbian rant that could only stoke historic animosities. And among his massed and fervent Serbian supporters, he lit a fire. Soon groups of Serbs were meeting privately, remembering their heritage, drinking, singing old songs, arming themselves, and preparing to refight the old battles, particularly the ones when Croats had sided with Germany in World War II, while Serbs had fought against them alongside the Soviet Union. These age-old vicious enmities had all been kept quiet under Tito, but they were kept alive. There was silence, but no forgetting. The Europeans as a whole could see the emergence of a post-Cold War world too, and many were asking whether NATO and the American troop presence in Europe was still needed. French diplomats reportedly reminded the United States that what might be happening in Yugoslavia was a European problem, and that Europeans could handle it without American help. And it wasn't only Yugoslavia. The whole world was stirring. Old perspectives seemed out of date. Alliances seemed obsolescent. Commitments seemed unnecessary. Governments were overthrown. Alignments were changing. In Romania, longtime dictator Nicolae Ceausescu was captured in vicious fighting and subsequently executed on Christmas Day, 1989. East Germans, Czechs, Hungarians, and Poles were throwing off the Soviet yoke of the Warsaw Pact, which was officially dissolved on the 1st of July, 1991. Even the long-repressed Baltic republics were rising up, seeking independence and fending off the last vestiges of Soviet imperialism. In August 1991, I watched on CNN as Russian President Boris Yeltsin mounted a tank and turned away a feeble coup attempt aimed at saving the old system. The Soviet Union itself was dissolving. And in faraway Afghanistan, new forces were moving to fill the power vacuum left when the Soviets departed, leaving their puppet regime fatally weakened. These were the Taliban, militant Islamists, using the name of God and the magnetic power of faith to take over a war-ravaged country. It had been the Soviet Union's Vietnam, and now thousands of victorious fighters were seeking to consolidate their power. Elsewhere, old Cold War conflicts lingered, even after the superpower competition was gone. Africa had been racked by war, and now the entrenched hatreds and the legacy of war fueled continual fighting within and among nations. From Ethiopia and Eritrea in the east, through Sudan, Somalia, Tanzania, Namibia, and Angola, up to Liberia and Sierra Leone, and into the heart of Africa in countries like Rwanda and Burundi, almost everywhere there was violence, conflict, or open warfare. I tried to follow the news. I would occasionally see someone I knew among the newsmakers, like French General Coe, on assignment to the new United Nations mission in the Balkans. But the events were distant and poorly reported. The actors were largely unknown, and the origins of conflict often obscure. In these years, Gert and I were living near vibrant civilian communities. Colorado Springs, Kansas City, the Los Angeles area, and not far from Austin in central Texas. Around the Army post, there was new construction and increasing signs of prosperity. The old coffee houses and topless bars of the Vietnam era were largely gone, and many of the pawn shops and cheap secondhand stores were vanishing as well. Even the fast food shops were being dressed up. Wherever we lived, we made local friends. We visited the local attractions. We felt at peace in America. In the early 1990s, most everyone seemed to be caught up in their day-to-day lives. The days when America felt threatened, even closer to nuclear war, were gone. It was over. President George H.W. Bush was calling it the New World Order. Historian Francis Fukuyama wrote a book whose title stuck, The End of History. And in no place did we feel any real awareness of what was happening abroad. People were patriotic and proud, and of course we'd done our duty against Saddam Hussein's aggression in Kuwait. But for most Americans, the rest of the world was a long way away. By September 1991, Gert and I were saying goodbye to Fort Irwin. It had been our home twice, and each time we'd put our whole heart and souls into every aspect of the mission. We loved the people we'd served with, and there were a lot of tears driving back to Virginia for my new position at Training and Doctrine Command. It was a 2-star position, Major General. I'd be one of the key staff members from General Fred Franks, helping him embed the lessons of the Gulf War and the National Training Center in Army warfighting doctrine and in our materiel requirements. We moved into a big house. I met my staff of 300 military and civilians. The work was all day, 6 days a week, and 2 briefcases of work every evening at home. And after a month or so, I ran into former Army Chief of Staff General Carl Vono, now retired, at a briefing. "Wes, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be commanding a division somewhere." A few days later, the new Army Chief of Staff, Gordon Sullivan, called. "Don't hang any pictures," he said. "You won't be there long." A few weeks later, we got orders to report to the 1st Cavalry Division at Fort Hood, Texas. I would become a division commander of one of the most storied divisions in the Army. It had been formed on horseback in 1921 to patrol the Mexican border, deployed to the Pacific without horses in World War II. It helped liberate the Philippines, occupied Japan, fought in Korea, converted to the 1st Air Cavalry Division for Vietnam, and finally returned to Fort Hood in 1972 to be reorganized as an armor division. The unit had just fought in Desert Storm under Major General John Tillelly, and after I took over command from him, I'd get them ready for the next problem. But in late March, Dad called to tell me he was going in for open heart surgery. After my mother died in 1986, Dad, though he was my stepfather, had assumed her role as my booster, counselor, and confidant. Dad had the surgery, and his recovery at first was fine. He was still in the hospital and was cheerful enough, but he was an old man, and he'd just been through major surgery. In addition, he'd apparently had a minor stroke, then caught pneumonia. Week after week, his condition swung back and forth, now in intensive care, then back on the ward. I visited almost every weekend. In May 1992, our son Wes graduated from Georgetown. He'd made a strong record in the School of Foreign Service and had taught English in Czechoslovakia for 2 summers. But he'd really enjoyed ROTC, where he'd made good friends with other cadets and thrived on the field training exercises. When we arrived for his graduation ceremony, he met us in his new Army uniform. "Oh, he looks so good," Gert exclaimed. Yes, he truly did. I administered his oath of commission. Then Gert and I, one at each shoulder, pinned on his gold second lieutenant's bars. Gert beamed and cried. I hadn't seen her so happy in many years. I was proud of him, but also a little bit concerned, knowing how much the uniform I wore and the Army life our family led may have influenced him in his choice of profession. But he was young, and whether he stayed and made the Army his career or not, I knew that a few years in uniform could only do him good. Then it was back to Arkansas, where Gert and I spent our time between assignments with Dad as his struggle continued. And at last, in July, it was time for me to report to Fort Hood. But I assured Dad I'd be back soon. I'd only been gone 3 days when the hospital called. "Your dad passed away this morning." At first, I was stunned. Then I was confused, angry, terribly sad. His death was a heavy blow. Life is precious, it's so precious, and people fight for hope. And while there's hope, they fight to live. And no matter what they may look like on the outside, elderly and infirm, inside they're a young person, at once loved and yet alone in a terrible ordeal. Dad's death closed an important chapter in my life. The love for my parents was now something I could only remember and hold in my heart. I had to pass that love on to my son, and Wes was far away pursuing his own Army career. Gert and I put our hearts back into the Army and the Army families. With my division, I practiced all the leadership lessons I'd learned over the years: morale building, command team socials, frequent dialogue within top levels of command, off-site meetings to thrash out vision and command philosophies, annual and quarterly briefs to establish objectives and tasks, periodic performance counseling 2 levels down, and lots of walking around, talking, and making myself available. We took the training we developed for the reserves during the Gulf War, the lane training, and built on it to focus on the small-scale teamwork that wins battles. Repetitive rotations to the National Training Center had finally gripped the whole Army. Non-commissioned officers knew their duties, and they were prepared to take command in the field. Battalion commanders now brought real training center or combat experience as company commanders to their duties, and the Army focused tightly on correcting any problems detected in the last war. All the generals knew this wasn't enough, but it was where we had to start while we tried to understand the major international forces at play in the new era. And we had to take care of our people, too. If they weren't retained, motivated, and developed, we'd have no Army left. So I had to work the community responsibilities as well, including support for the schools and various housing areas. When I visited the Fort Hood High School for the first time, I asked the principal where the main problems were. It soon came out that teenage gangs were the untreated and so far untreatable wounds in Fort Hood society. I asked who the gang members were, and some clots of teenagers in the atrium after lunch were pointed out to me. So I walked over to them, smiling my friendliest smile. One young woman turned to face me as I approached, so I spoke first to her. "So, what does your father do?" "In the Army," she said through clenched teeth. He's in Hawaii. I hate him. She was 15, petite, attractive, Hispanic, and angry. She lived with her mother and stepfather, who was also in the Army. There were fights at home, and she needed her friend, she said, gesturing around to the small group nearby. The principal had already warned me that the girls often packed knives for the boys to use. But she looked like no threat, and I kept her talking about neighborhoods, activities, and how to make things better. Then she drifted off, and I moved on to the others, seeking their feelings, trying to see their world. We identified the parents by name, counseled them, made them more aware of their children's behavior. We worked hard to provide more activities for teenagers on post and cleaned out the brushy areas between neighborhoods where the older kids would hang out at night. Bit by bit, the violence and the fear went down. I'd learned over the years that a linkage between parents and teachers was crucial. Parents should really know what's going on in school. That means that when a student receives notice he has to report to a teacher or other official for guidance counseling, the parent should be given the time off from work so they can be there. We picked 2 schools, got the parents together at a PTA meeting, and explained the new program. From the back, one of our sergeants asked, "So you don't trust us to know what's going on? You want to force us to be there?" "No," one of my staff explained, "we want to make it possible for you to be there, no matter what the conflicting duty requirements may be." The program was a success, and soon it was adopted by every school at Fort Hood and later across much of the Army. Parental involvement was recognized as the key to improved education. When the parents heard things about the behavior of their child in school straight from the teacher, they were able to ask questions and then to team up with the teacher to help their child reach his or her full potential. In education, there's no measure of accountability more important than a parent's love and a teacher's commitment, teamed together to prepare a child for life. With the disappearance of the Soviet Union, the world had changed. Now it seemed the Army was being used as more of a humanitarian relief mechanism abroad. One U.S. Army division was tapped to go to Somalia to help deliver relief supplies, despite warnings about what the country would be like. Within the military, these were called Operations Other Than War, UTWA, or sometimes Military Operations Other Than War, MUTWA. Whatever it was going to be called, we watched from the sidelines as tragedy ensued and struggled to understand the implications for the Army. Fighting had begun in June 1993 in Somalia when a local warlord ambushed a United Nations column. The security situation was deteriorating. Now U.S. units and equipment were being actively deployed. By October 1993, we were getting strange requests and directives like, "Have 2 OH-58 Delta Kiowa Warriors ready for airlift by 0900 Sunday. You may send 1 maintenance tech, but no crews." But there was a major lesson here being ignored, a lesson our Army had learned many times over. When you deploy, send cohesive units. Don't pick units to pieces, and don't go into combat or near combat with patchwork outfits. Why do we have to relearn old lessons at the expense of our soldiers, I wondered. And there was a new president from Arkansas. One Saturday morning, as several of us were out riding our horses at Fort Hood, the Corps commander, Lieutenant General Pete Taylor, leaned over and said, "So the president's a friend of yours?" It was said casually, but there was a bit of accusation, too. Taylor continued, "He asked the chief at West Point last week if he knew my friend, Wes Clark." Well, we had met once in college, but not at Oxford. I left a couple of months before he arrived there. And we'd had dinner together once when I passed through Arkansas several years before. With the Army's permission, he'd appointed me to serve along with about 30 other people as one of his commissioners for the White House Fellows Program. Still, I wouldn't have thought he was a friend. But in October 1993, a few days after 18 American soldiers were killed in Mogadishu, Somalia, Gert and I were in Washington for the introduction of the new class of fellows. With no warning, the president walked right over to Gert, called her by name, and took me aside to meet the vice president, invited us upstairs for dinner. The invitation was unexpected. I was totally surprised. Soon we were upstairs in the White House in a dining room wallpapered with pictures of West Point cadets. It was so ordinary and yet so overwhelming. This was the President of the United States. And Gert and I were sitting at his table and eating supper with him and his wife and some others from Arkansas, including the Oscar-winning actress Mary Steenburgen. Then the talk at the table turned to our response in Mogadishu. What do you think we should do? He the President of the United States was asking me. I felt a little disoriented as I tried to answer. This was far beyond the leadership, discipline, training, tank repair, and family welfare issues I was working every day at Fort Hood. But I'd give him my view. I recounted the options as I saw: withdraw, hold steady, or reinforce. And told him, reinforce with at least a division and clean them out. Please don't let them get away with this kind of attack against our soldiers. He didn't do that, however, for he found a way to reinforce offshore to pose a deterrent threat while taking no action, and soon our troops were withdrawn. The post-Cold War world was increasingly unfamiliar and would tax the imagination, skills, and character of soldiers and political leaders alike. Institutions like the U.S. military and the U.S. government have a difficult time adapting to new environments. We'd already confronted this problem before when we were rebuilding the Army in the mid-'70s. But the problem then was the Soviet threat, how to fight outnumbered and win, how to defeat the second echelon forces, how to manage rear area security and protection against Soviet special forces. Now there was no Soviet threat. We'd spent 20 years working this problem. And during that time, we designed new organizations, built new equipment, revamped training, created new disciplines of study in organizational art and leadership development, opened new facilities, changed our ethos and our mindset. We recruited a whole new cadre of non-commissioned officers. The sergeants are the backbone of the Army, and built a system of schooling to educate and train them through their 20-plus year careers. We've become an army of professionals, skilled and dedicated warriors, increasingly focused on the use of powerful weapons to destroy a powerfully equipped armored enemy force. So what was the new purpose of our military institutions to be? And what would motivate the men and women and their families to serve, to move, to sacrifice year after year? That's the perennial question, and it must be asked over and over again. We took pride in the outcome of the Gulf War. For Saddam's legions, they never had a chance. But was this all the purpose we had in mind for the Army we were building, or would there be more? And what would we need to do to our Army to enable it to win the first and last battles of the next campaign? We sensed then that these were questions that would take years to answer and decades more to learn if our answers were right. Now we're hopefully going to emerge from the latest wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the war on terror. After these wars, and there will be an after, the Army will again have to pack away some vested interests and pick up new tasks, whatever they might be. We should put down a marker now, for the Army must stay abreast of a changing environment, study it, report it, and develop military requirements from it. That will always be necessary, but when change comes, we must not be too reluctant to drop old ideas, requirements, and material. And it won't just be the Army, it will be the nation. We'll always be in a new environment, and we'll have to adapt as a nation. It's always a daunting prospect, but we've proven time and again as a nation that we're equal to the challenge. 10. Pursuing a Fresh Strategy, 1994-1995. The J5 should be able to drive the staff, General Shalikashvili explained as he interviewed me a few months later. Will you be able to do that? John Shalikashvili, the son of a noble family from Soviet Georgia, immigrated to the United States in the early 1950s and rose to become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top officer in the armed forces. Shali was enormously admired and respected. Having arrived in the United States at age 16, he earned an ROTC commission and rose steadily on the basis of his sound judgment, keen insights, hard work, and even temper. He had made it up the ladder through every station of the cross, one of the 75% of captains who make major, one of the 60% of majors who make lieutenant colonel, one of the 50% of lieutenant colonels who make colonel, one of the 5% of colonels selected for brigadier general, one of the 50% of brigadier generals selected for major general, one of the 10% or so of major generals selected annually for lieutenant general, one of the 2 or 3 lieutenant generals selected annually for 4-star general, and finally, the 1 4-star general selected every 4 years from among all the generals and admirals of all the services to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And people liked him, too. Yes, Shali posed the right question. Could I really do the job? And he and I both knew that we wouldn't know the answer until I got to the Joint Staff in Washington and tried. The J5, Director of Strategic Plans and Policy, was the bridge to the national security planning process, to the United Nations, and even substantively to Capitol Hill. All of the big issues passed through the shop and its 300-plus officers and civilians. The question was, would we make any difference? Or would we just be the transmission line, in effect, passive observers? Shali chose me to try. In late March 1994, we said our goodbyes at Fort Hood. I'd ridden in a cavalry charge with the Horse Cavalry Platoon, saber drawn and galloping across a half-mile-wide field, then vaulting over a ditch. The change of command took place in front of division headquarters, and Gert was given a bouquet of yellow roses. General Denny Reimer, commander of the Forces Command, took the colors from me and passed them to Major General Rick Shinseki, my replacement, and then he pinned on my third star as young First Lieutenant Wesley Clark II stood watching. When I became the J5, we also moved into a house at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C., a big white-pillared colonial with a picturesque view of the Potomac River and Haines Point. If I looked for it in the distance, I could even see the Washington Monument from my backyard. I could run the 1-mile loop around Post or hit golf balls across the parade field in front of my home. And it was only a 7-minute drive to the Pentagon. No one, I thought, ever deserved to live this well. But the job also came with some big problems. My deputy, Major General John Admire, came in to brief me on my first day in the office. Our staff work is compromised, he explained. General Barry McCaffrey had been gone for months, and before I arrived, we'd been picked apart by the Joint Staff principals and in the interagency. So this was what Shali implied about driving the staff. Okay, I thought, I understood. Then my executive officer, Colonel Tom Banks, pushed a stack of 3-ring binders across the table at me. Sir, here are your prep books. You'll need to study them in preparation for your testimony before the Armed Services Committee next week. The binders were stacked a foot high and filled with acronyms, names, places, issues, and problems. This wasn't the NTC or the CAV. It was a whole world I'd have to master to be effective, literally, a whole world. The J5's breadth ran across every continent and to every war plan and every policy, treaty, and issue in the United States government that had national security implications, even to issues like recommending approval of requests to export defense-related technology. I'd always said I wanted to work on national security issues, and so far I'd had great preparation in understanding the Army from top to bottom. Now I'd have to learn a considerable amount in a wide range of new areas. Meanwhile, in the wake of the collapsed Soviet Empire, others around the world were also exploring the new environment. In the Balkans, there was open warfare. Serb dictator Milosevic had seized control of the Yugoslav government and army, and other ethnic groups in their former respective areas were forced to fight for their own independence. Slovenia had made it, easily repulsing the Serbs. Croatia had fought back as well and was free and recognized by the world as an independent state, but divided by continuing ethnic warfare. Bosnia had also declared independence, but was under attack from both paramilitaries and Serb forces, as well as deeply split ethnically. The country was in its 3rd year as an active war zone. Its countryside had been ravaged. The capital, Sarajevo, was besieged, and thousands of UN peacekeepers were struggling to restrain and contain the conflict. In the Caribbean, the Duvalier regime that had long controlled Haiti was gone. A democratic election had placed Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a Catholic priest, in charge. But the military had soon staged a coup against him and had taken over the government. Most of the governments of the Western Hemisphere, led by the United States, were protesting and attempting to pressure the coup leaders into accepting Aristide's return, but to no avail. On the other side of the world, our old nemesis, North Korean dictator Kim Il-sung, had turned away international inspectors and might be preparing to reprocess spent nuclear fuel in order to manufacture nuclear weapons, a direct challenge to the U.S. security umbrella in Northeast Asia. Pakistan also had engaged in nuclear activities and was under U.S. sanctions. In the Middle East, our new president had already struck Iraq with cruise missiles, but he'd also worked out a promise of agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. And he was keeping Iran in the deep freeze with a policy of dual containment of both Iraq and Iran, while sustaining ties with traditional friends in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia. In Africa, we were still coping with the aftermath of that brief flurry of combat in Mogadishu that had burst on us in the previous October, while trying to structure a way to conclude our mission there and remove our remaining troops. There were occasional reports about mujahideen from Afghanistan in the area, but nothing specific enough to raise an alarm. And among other African conflicts, there was the festering struggle between two rival tribes, the Hutu and the Tutsi, in the Central African states of Rwanda and Burundi. Outside of Russia and the Balkans, Europe itself was in turmoil. There was fighting between government forces and rebels in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, and in Tajikistan, and also between Azerbaijan and Armenia in a disputed region called Nagorno-Karabakh. And in addition to NATO, there was a multiplicity of institutions struggling with problems, an alphabet soup of overlapping memberships, ambitions, and bureaucracies. There was Partnership for Peace, the European Union, the West European Union, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. That's PFP, EU, WEU, OSCE, and many other smaller organizations as well. And even within the European Union, not all members were equal in the latest quest for European integration. Inside the Pentagon and in Washington, there was a continuing concern over the size of the U.S. military, and especially the nuclear-armed missiles, submarines, and bombers left over from the Cold War. Many of us in government would be working on these issues, for they were the concerns of many agencies and leaders, from the president down. But my team in J5 was responsible for shaping the military's perspective for General Shalikashvili and communicating it to the others, while defending our military interests as policy was being formulated. Still, I was singled out by a Washington Post gossip piece a few weeks before I arrived that said I could drop by the White House and have lunch with the president at any time I wanted. While that reputation gave me a lot of heft as I met people within the interagency process, it also singled me out for targeting by partisan Republicans on the Hill. Not that it mattered in gossip-hungry Washington, D.C., but it just wasn't true either. Gert listened to my brief descriptions of what I was up against and said, "Well, this is what you wanted." And as usual, she was right. I did want this job. I was on the varsity team. But unlike most sports, there was no off-season in which to get ready. Crises and problems hit from my second day on the job, and the onslaught continued every succeeding day, including almost every weekend. The two presidents of Rwanda and Burundi had been shot down as they flew into Kigali the previous night. Were they shot down by one of our lost stingers from Afghanistan? 2 days later, the French and Belgians invaded Rwanda to rescue their citizens, and the fighting was on CNN. What should we do about it? The next morning, a Saturday, we were discussing the upcoming trip to Korea by the Secretary of Defense, but we had to face some salient new questions. Does the war plan need to be updated? And what will North Korea do if we go to the UN for sanctions? On Sunday, it was, what are the appropriate air rules of engagement to enable us to generate maximum pressure on the Serbs over Bosnian airspace and still remain within international law? And on Monday morning, one of my assistants who'd been out of town the previous week reported that he was part of the group preparing plans to invade Haiti, I asked. But I was impressed with the team of officers I was working with in the Joint Staff. A few years earlier, General Colin Powell, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs, had put out a call for higher quality in the Joint Staff, and Shali had kept up the pressure. The results of their efforts were plain to see, for these officers could keep up with anyone, in government or outside. They all had advanced degrees, loads of energy, could write and brief well. They were formidable at the table in the interagency process. No wonder you could hear the occasional grumbling about the primacy of civilian control from the various secretaries' offices on the third floor of the Pentagon. But all the way down, they were an impressively competent group of uniformed officers, all capable of handling the most sophisticated issues, arguments, and positions. They would have been outstanding leaders in any American business or industry. However, in that spring and early summer of 1994, our government seemed to be lurching from crisis to crisis, problem to problem, finding stopgap solutions at the last minute, and growing steadily more fatigued. You paid a heavy price for the nonstop weekend meetings, I discovered. This was not only because they took energy, but also because they consumed the time normally devoted to the reflection and preparation that would result in momentum during the next work week. Washington, I found, was a one-issue, never-stop town. Whatever was current dominated the press, and so hogged the dialogue on the Hill. The administration would find itself too soon in the response mode, trying to coordinate testimony, issue press statements, and attend to urgent response and long-range considerations simultaneously. There were morning meetings of the deputies committees in the White House Situation Room to prepare for afternoon meetings of principals and simultaneous interagency working groups trying to look ahead to the next day's problems, with Sunday morning calls to coordinate before the Sunday talk shows. After I'd been in the job only a few weeks, during which I'd already made the trip to Korea, Shawley pulled me aside. "Wes, we hired you to be the strategist. So what is this strategy that has us facing a crisis every weekend?" He said it in a nice way, but I knew he was being pounded by the administration and by critics on the Hill. What was the strategy? Congress was hammering away with a seemingly endless series of issues, questions, and concerns, and first on their list was one simple question: did the administration have a strategy? There was also a provision of the 1986 Goldwater-Nichols Act that called on the Pentagon to write a national military strategy, though one had not been written. And why was that? In fact, the United States was lost in the post-Cold War world. Our country was adrift, and if not in immediate danger of annihilation, then certainly in danger of losing its way, squandering its resources, and failing to secure its vital interests. In the Cold War, we'd had a strategy. It was formulated step by step by both Democratic and Republican administrations. It was an American strategy. The first principle was we wouldn't withdraw from the old world, as we had after World War I. Rather, we would remain engaged abroad. We helped create the United Nations. Then, as the Soviet Union began to be recognized as an adversary, we provided assistance to countries like Greece, who were resisting communist subversion. American diplomat George Kennan, an expert on the Soviet Union, published a seminal article in Foreign Affairs entitled "The Sources of Soviet Conduct," suggesting that if we just contained the Soviets, their system would ultimately collapse. In keeping with that concept, when North Korea invaded the South, we sent U.S. troops into the fight, battling to contain communism on its periphery. We also sought and gained legitimacy and international support for our purposes and interests. We tried to build international law and act within it. We pushed decolonialization. We tried to act not simply in our own interests, but also in support of others. Spurred by the Soviets in the Korean War, the U.S. rearmed, built alliances in Europe and across Asia, and on occasion used covert means to block Soviet expansionist efforts. But Eisenhower also rejected the concept of preventive war against the Soviets. He refused to go along with the rollback of communist gains in Eastern Europe and stood firm for decolonization and against British and French intervention in Egypt. He also supported a dialogue, even hosting the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev on a 1959 tour of America. The Cold War strategy seemed to encompass every aspect of America, not just foreign policy and the military. New incentives were given to strengthen American industry, and especially its research and development. School curricula were updated to strengthen language, math, science skills, and physical fitness in the face of the Soviet challenge. American universities opened their doors to foreign students to expose them to our ideas. Libraries were built around the world to explain America. And even American multinational corporations were playing a role in spreading our ideas and values. And while Democrats and Republicans always had a somewhat different take on the value of power and strength versus the value of dialogue and legal agreements, nevertheless there was a broad and bipartisan consensus on major elements of our approach. General Powell and Lieutenant General Lee Butler as J5 had seen the looming strategy vacuum years earlier. They had created the base force as a rationale for hanging on to most of the military, even though the Soviet threat it had been built to defend against was gone. In essence, the argument was that the United States was a major power with worldwide interests to protect, so we needed to retain a large force. But this formulation really wasn't a strategy, except maybe a strategy to hang on to military spending. To be sure, Powell had a point, because you could eliminate military capabilities in a matter of months. As chairman of the JCS, for example, he'd led the effort to pull back and eliminate the Army's chemical and nuclear artillery capabilities, which were now gone. But when you started cutting units, dismissing troops and officers, and eliminating base structure and industrial productions, these were cuts that, if those forces were needed again, would take years and years to overcome. But the question remained, what's the threat, and could it be used to drive a strategy akin to that of the Cold War? Ted Warner, one of the Assistant Secretaries of Defense, worked with the White House and State Department. He and others began to use a standard formulation of the four dangers: regional instability, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, transnational threats like terrorism, narco-trafficking, and organized crime, and the threat of a resurgent Russia should it change its orientation toward the West. Yes, I thought, those four pretty well captured the range of problems. A visiting Chinese general described his study, which showed that now there'd be more conflict within nations than between nations. UN peacekeeping was running at record levels with over 70,000 blue helmets deployed. We compared perceptions with other nations in staff talks, normally with harmonious results. Still, none of this constituted a sufficient threat to drive an overall national strategy, at least nothing to replace the Cold War strategy. There'd be no magic formula that could be applied to work the post-Cold War world. If we were to create a strategy, it would be based on our actions, on how we dealt with each problem, rather than on some abstract theory we might go to for guidance. During the course of 1994, 95, and into 96, this was difficult, challenging work. But there was no shortage of ideas. Almost everyone in the State Department, it seemed, had a pet idea on how the military could be used. And the normal Joint Staff response, I learned, was to throw the problem right back onto the suits at State. Tell us precisely what you want us to do, and we'll tell you what we'll need and what it will cost to do it. But even so, because it had funds that could be diverted, as well as transportation, communications, and other logistics that could be commandeered for non-military purposes, the military quickly discovered it was the go-to agency. For its part, the administration was hard-pressed, and one major issue was Africa. Faced with a deepening civil conflict and reports of large-scale massacres in Rwanda, the administration temporized and worked through the United Nations. As the principal staff officer working UN policy issues, we were involved in fashioning a response. Madeleine Albright, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, wanted a plan, and so I tasked my Middle East chief, Colonel Perry Baltimore, with crafting a military response that could insert a force to stop the slaughter. Then I took the result to my boss, General Shalikashvili. "Sir, here's the plan," I said. I held out the briefing papers and map for him to scan. U.S. logistics, intel, command and control, some troops on the ground, maybe 20,000. It'll take a couple of months, cost upwards of $2 billion, I continued. We couldn't go in halfway and fail. When the United States did something, it had to do it right, I believed. If there was one single principle to hold on to, the major lesson of Vietnam, this was it. Be slow to go in and make sure you have enough combat power and capabilities to do the job. Otherwise, don't go in. Wes, do you seriously believe anyone in Congress will support such a plan now in Africa, 8 months after Mogadishu? Well, probably not, I admitted. "Neither do I," he said. "Give it to me. I'll take care of this." That was the last I heard of the plan. Discussions and briefings continued in New York, and the Rwandan Tutsi army, which had been building its forces in Uganda, launched an attack to recapture the country. This time it was the Hutus on the receiving end. The French launched a stabilization mission, ostensibly to stop the fighting and protect refugees, but they actually provided support to the Hutus. And then the United States put together its own humanitarian operation in western Zaire to provide water and relief to several 100,000 Hutus who'd fled Rwanda. Over the next year, the terrible stories of the slaughter trickled out of Rwanda. Teachers had slain their students. Priests had turned on their parishioners. It was pure genocide against the Tutsis, usually accomplished by machete. Parents were begging murderers to shoot their children instead of chopping them up, and then, if their grisly requests were granted, the parents were forced to pay for the bullets. One man received permission to throw his children down a well and jump after them. The stories of horror were endless and gut-wrenching. The United States could have taken action. We could have made a difference, but we didn't. We'd failed, and I had been part of that failure. On North Korea, we did better. While the interagency was busy preparing for the worst, President Clinton had secretly dispatched former President Jimmy Carter to see the North Korean leader. Carter negotiated a draft agreement that may well have saved the Koreas from a dangerous crisis, if not a highly destructive conflict. But all that had been done was to open a door to an alternative. It still had to be formally agreed to and approved by both parties. Ambassador Robert Gallucci, Assistant Secretary of State, took charge of the negotiations, and working as part of the interagency team, my staff and I helped craft the U.S. positions as the negotiations progressed. As usual, there were varying positions on the issues. How much would the North Koreans give up, and when? When would they turn over the spent uranium fuel rods? When would we commence construction of 2 light water nuclear reactors that had been promised? I worked my way into the technicalities of the issues and studied the records of previous negotiations with the North Koreans. And in all cases, I found the North Koreans had been incredibly tough-minded, stubborn, and graceless. They just didn't see compromises the way Westerners did. But if you looked at the conflict from their point of view, as a small, isolated country, you could see their rationality. They weren't crazy, just hard-nosed and fearful. I joined Gallucci in arguing for an approach that recognized North Korea's interest in hanging on to the fuel rods as long as possible. This was their negotiating leverage. Force them to give it up too soon, and they'd have to walk out. They'd see no more reason to trust us than we had to trust them. To be successful then, the negotiations had to give each side something it could consider a win. Eventually, the negotiations produced something called the Agreed Framework. The United States, South Korea, and Japan would provide North Korea with 2 light water reactors for power generation. Controls would prevent any diversion of nuclear materials, and the United States would also supply thousands of tons of fuel oil in the interim, while the reactor was being built. In return, the North Koreans would cease their nuclear work at their existing reactor, and the spent fuel rods would be canned or placed in a safe storage but not reprocessed, and would be surrendered at a later time as the 2 nuclear reactors were constructed. None of us believed the agreed framework was the end of the matter, however. What for us was one problem among many was for the North Koreans a matter of regime survival. But for now, at least, we'd averted a crisis. Everything seemed to happen simultaneously in the post-Cold War world. Problems weren't sequential. And even while we delivered relief supplies to Rwanda and worked the negotiation with North Korea, conditions were prompting our engagement in Haiti. The total economic embargo of that Caribbean nation led to a further deterioration inside Haiti, a great and growing number of refugees seeking escape in small boats, and an almost unmanageable effort to rescue them at sea and intern them at the U.S. military base at Guantanamo, Cuba. A White House decision was made to invade, using a combination of airborne and sea-landed forces, as authorized by the United Nations. Then at the last minute, as the troops were in the air, negotiations in Port-au-Prince between a top-level U.S. delegation and the coup leader, General Raul Cedras, led to his capitulation and acceptance of asylum in Panama. The airborne assault force turned around in the air and returned to Fort Bragg, and the other force, under Lieutenant General Hugh Shelton and Major General Dave Meade, came ashore the next morning, unopposed. In J-5, we were deeply involved in the effort. From the moment I first saw the plan in July 1994, I could see a looming, slow-motion disaster. That afternoon, I went to see General Shalikashvili. "Sir, your plan for Haiti has a real problem," I began. Shali looked up from his desk. "And what is that?" "Sir, there's no exit strategy. Once we're in, we're in. We'll be in the same fix in which we're now finding ourselves in Somalia." It was a military-only plan, tightly classified, and it had no plan for what to do after our troops got in and took over. He took a second to think, but only a second. "Yes, you're right. Fix it," he said. Over the next few days, I went to New York City with Ambassador Albright to help negotiate a handover of the mission to the United Nations after the first 6 months. Boutros Boutros-Ghali was simmering across the table, but his head of peacekeeping operations, Kofi Annan, was more accommodating. We eventually got our UN Security Council resolution and turnover plan accepted. I then formed an interagency group to explore the ramifications of the planned takeover and to bring in other necessary agencies. Soon everyone was coming to the second floor conference room, expressing concerns and offering ideas. Richard Clark was there representing the National Security Council staff. Walt Slocum and Ted Warner from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Mark Schneider from the Agency for International Development, and many others. A principal issue was public order and policing. Who would do this if we took out the Haitian Armed Forces, the so-called FAD, in our invasion, because the Haitian organization was all the police there were? I had explicit instructions from Shali. We don't do police work. It was a seemingly obvious lesson from Somalia. The Department of Justice could do police training to create a Haitian police force, but they couldn't even start planning until the operation was underway because they had no money. I explained the problem to Shali, whose response was immediate. "You become the police training officer," he said. "You fix it." Eventually, Deputy Secretary of Defense John Deutsch ended up calling nations to beg for police monitors, and we got them. We suggested the Atlantic Command host an interagency rehearsal before the invasion, and then we turned over the working group to Richard Clark at the NSC. They were the ones who should be tasking other departments of government, I believed, not the Joint Staff. I began extensive liaison with Haitian President Bertrand Aristide, whom we were restoring to office, and his assistant, René Preval, now president, as well as with the U.S. Atlantic Command, which was in charge of the intervention. Finally, as the operation unfolded and it was time to insert U.S. forces rather than have them invade, Slocum and I rewrote the operational directive at 10 p.m. that Sunday night in my office. The landing of the U.S. troops went smoothly, but on the first day of the operation, some of them stood by as a Haitian was beaten to death in front of TV cameras. That night on White House instruction, Slocum and I rewrote the rules of engagement. U.S. military forces didn't do police work, true, but we weren't going to stand by as crimes were committed and allow disorder to spread. It's too bad that lesson wasn't retained for use in Iraq. At the same time, Bosnia was becoming a principal concern for me. A U.S. peace effort had stalled, fighting was continuing, and every battlefield reversal prompted a new crisis. Inside the Pentagon, Bosnia was kind of an orphan on the staff. No one from our staff had been there, no U.S. troops were present, and it was a continuing series of crises for the United Nations and the Europeans. And that's how I came to make my first trip to the former Yugoslavia in August 1994. And was able to meet both Bosnian and Serb leaders, including the then unindicted but plenty evil General Ratko Mladic. That visit enabled me to write an informed strategy document on the conflict for the NSC staff and the interagency group. Nothing much changed with respect to Bosnia during the autumn of '94, but the administration was clearly gaining a grip on its foreign policy, to the evident disappointment of the politicians on the other side of the aisle. The Republicans had seen the muffs and blunders of 1993 and believed they'd found a key opening for partisan politics. Meanwhile, Gert had accepted a volunteer position with Republican Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison of Texas. Kay had heard of Gert through her friends at Fort Hood and asked her repeatedly to come in and help, and eventually Gert agreed, but on the condition that she should help only on military family issues and only as an unpaid volunteer. But the hallway rumble in Congress was unmistakable, and Gert couldn't help overhearing the plotting and scheming in Republican partisan circles. "We're going to get him on foreign affairs," they said. "Clinton is weak, confused, he doesn't know what he's doing, he's vulnerable." That's the way our political system works. The opposition party spots vulnerabilities in the presiding government and offers the electorate an alternative. In this case, the Republicans had found what they believed was a glaring weakness, and they would exploit it. That's elementary in principle, but in practice it's often not so clear. As a senior officer working on important issues, I became part of that political environment. And this was true even though I was scrupulously non-political, and my best connections, in fact, were with the old defense intellectual crowd of Republican administrations. But if the military work coming out of the Pentagon succeeded, that meant President Clinton succeeded, and the Republicans would have no issue to pick with him. That made it very easy to understand why I became one of the targets for the Republicans. At one hearing, as I was waiting to testify, one of my assistants noticed a staffer who worked for Republican leader Trent Lott going around the room. He was handing out papers to each Republican senator or their staffer. My assistant went up to say hello to the staffer and discovered he was passing out a note advising that I was a Rhodes Scholar from Arkansas and my military testimony was not to be trusted. A few weeks later, I called a West Point classmate, a federal judge in Mississippi, to have him ask Senator Lott to call it off. "Oh, Clinton's ruined it for all those Rhodes Scholars," the senator reportedly replied to my friend. However, he did agree to stop the attacks on my experience and judgment. But at another point, some staff officers were circulating a petition to have me fired, and it dutifully was sent to Senator Hutchison's office. "No, I don't think so," her chief of staff said. "His wife works here." It was not really a rude awakening, because I knew the political knives in Washington were sharp and swiftly wielded, often in the dark. It really came down to what General Shalikashvili had told me once. He said, if you want to make a difference in this town, you've got to be prepared to take the heat. But it was also true that no matter how nonpartisan the senior military attempted to be, The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was the principal military advisor to the President and the Secretary of Defense. That meant the top military staff could hardly be divorced from the success and failures of national security policy, and these outcomes, of course, carried political consequences. And this meant, among other things, that the basic premise on which the Army had been rebuilt after the Vietnam War, the notion of pure military professionalism, a warrior spirit divorced from other elements of U.S. power, law, diplomacy, marketplace economics, was simply too narrow to be effective. As for our purposes, well, step by step we were answering that question, what is our strategy? We would stay strong and stay engaged, use force only as a last resort, fight with allies at our side if we could, or by ourselves if we must. But somehow we had to take this response, ordered by the Democrats, and make it bipartisan, and then take a bipartisan strategy and gain public support for it, thus converting it into a national strategy. And then, eventually, we had to create the means and modify the forces to make it work. There was a lot to do to come to terms with the post-Cold War world. So far we had the ideas, but we didn't yet have a publicly understood and accepted strategy. 11. Diplomacy, diplomacy, diplomacy. 1995-1997. Sure enough, just as had been predicted by the experienced Balkan watchers, in May 1995 the Bosnian Muslims struck out from Sarajevo, then under siege by Serbian forces. The Serbs struck back, further squeezing Muslim enclaves isolated east of Sarajevo and nominally under UN protection. The British and French reinforced their UN troops and for the first time provided some long-range artillery. It was a welcome step because these UN troops, these blue-helmeted peacekeepers, were so poorly equipped and lightly armed they couldn't actually confront the Serbs and their armored vehicles, artillery, and air force. But the Serbs were on the move. First the enclave of Zepa fell. Then, despite international protests, an overflight, and a couple of bombs dropped by a NATO jet, the Serbs persuaded a Dutch battalion of blue helmets that resistance was futile in the enclave of Srebrenica. Dutch soldiers put down their weapons, and a Serb force entered and seized the Muslim population. Men were separated from families, and the women and children told to move out, back to the Muslim-held territory. Under the watchful eye of Serb General Ratko Mladic, some 7,000 Muslim men were loaded on trucks, taken a few miles away, and murdered in cold blood. At the time, NATO suspected what had happened, but except for some imperfect aerial photography, we lacked comprehensive evidence. Though we didn't know all the facts at the time, the Serb action against the safe areas was nevertheless deemed unacceptable. Various international leaders met in London to prepare a stronger diplomatic response and military options if Serb aggression continued. In Washington, Defense Secretary Bill Perry called some of the military and civilian leaders within the Defense Department who were tasked with these issues over to his townhouse in Alexandria on a Sunday night in late July 1995. National Security Advisor Tony Lake is putting together a new plan for negotiations, Perry explained, and we might be involved. U.S. Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, now Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, would probably lead the talks. Should the Department of Defense put people on the team, and if so, whom? Perry inquired. I looked over at General Shalikashvili. We both knew Holbrooke well. I'd already had a run-in with him over NATO enlargement. He was one of those at State who continued to advocate for more use of the military. This set of negotiations would definitely be a problem for the Defense Department. For that reason, it was determined that Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Joe Krusel and I would participate in the negotiations. Shortly thereafter, new fighting erupted in the Balkans as a revitalized Croatian military force attacked the Serb-held region of eastern Croatia. Dubbed Operation Lightning, this Croatian offensive achieved immediate and dramatic success. Now it was Serb civilians who were fleeing their homes and seeking protection into the Serb-held areas of Bosnia. Meanwhile, the Croatian forces continued their military campaign into the Croatian regions of southern Bosnia. The UN mission had finally failed. It was a victim of inadequate authority and under-equipped UN forces, actively sabotaged by the warring factions in Bosnia and by outside governments as well. It would be war now, and the UN troops themselves were at risk. With the flames of conflict spreading across Bosnia, Tony Lake, our interagency team leader, led the first phase of the new U.S. plan. With Tony was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Bob Fraser, National Security Staffer Sandy Vershbow, and from the Pentagon, Joe Cruzel and me. I was especially close to Cruzel, an Air Force Academy graduate with a Harvard doctorate and long experience in Eastern Europe. We traveled together in a small government jet to meet top leaders and discuss the Balkans. Lake explained to our European allies that this was America's plan and they had to support it. And in return, we pledged to deploy up to 25,000 U.S. troops in Bosnia under NATO control and to take over the mission from the United Nations. This was important, for the UN peacekeepers had already shown themselves to be powerless in the face of Serb threats to the civilians there. Our plan called for a separation of combatant forces, a territorial division of ethnic groups within Bosnia, and elections for a new Bosnian government, and the U.S. troops would return home within a year. It was London, Paris, Bonn, the Crimea, and Ankara in 4 days. Then Richard Holbrooke literally came off his honeymoon, met us in London, and took control, bringing with him Air Force Colonel and NSC staffer Nelson Drew. Our first stop was Split, Croatia, to meet the U.S. Ambassador, Peter Galbraith, there and organize our efforts. As we drove up along the coast, the view was spectacular, with glistening limestone cliffs and the deep, clear green of the Adriatic in the late summer afternoon. Staying at the Tower Hotel, tucked right beside the water in a small harbor, we noticed a third-floor balcony protruding out over the water. Yes, the proprietor told us in rough German, hotel guests sometimes got drunk and jumped from the balcony into the water at night. It was only about 12 meters high, he said. Joe and I looked at each other. Our faces were split by wide grins. What a perfect way to build team spirit. And why wait? Let's all jump. Richard Holbrooke demurred. Others declined, and eventually only Joe and I climbed up the railing. But as we climbed, the water dropped further and further away. And when we reached the balcony, the water was way down there, and we were way up here. Maybe we'd been a bit too eager. But no, the fat was in the fire now, and we really couldn't back down. So I jumped, and Joe followed. It was a long drop, but after we surfaced, we were truly gleeful. We swam across the harbor to a rocky quay, and when we pulled ourselves out of the water there, we kept smiling and laughing as we told each other, not bad for 50. The next day we began in earnest, first off to see Croatian President Franjo Tudjman, then into Belgrade to meet Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic, and finally back to Croatia. And as I watched Holbrooke work, my respect for him grew. He was smooth and eloquent in moving a complex diplomatic dialogue forward. He wasn't afraid to tackle tough issues within the team. He was very bright and a real workhorse. We were clearly feeling our way forward, but in him we had a good pathfinder. Milosevic was unable to guarantee that we could gain unimpeded access through the Serb siege to visit the president of Bosnia, Alija Izetbegovic, and his prime minister, Haris Seladic, in Sarajevo. So, on a Saturday morning, we caught a lift on a UN helicopter to the top of Mount Igman. It was UN-secured territory overlooking Sarajevo. There we were met by a U.S. Hummer and a French armored car for the trip through the battle zone into Sarajevo. Tension was high because the Serbs often engaged UN traffic on the mountain with anti-aircraft fire and had destroyed a vehicle on our route just a few days earlier. I asked Holbrooke to ride in the Hummer with me, and we put the rest of the team, including my assistant, Major Dan Gerstein, in the French armored vehicle. Then we started down the mountainside. We halted on a narrow cliffside road, trying to slip by a column of French trucks moving up the mountain. They had the inside position on the dirt track, and I could look out over the sharp drop-off beside us and see Sarajevo thousands of feet below. Then the French truck driver halted opposite us. He was gesturing and pointing. A buzz seemed to go through the stalled French column. Holbrooke, speaking French, was trying to make sense of it. Some drivers were dismounting their vehicles, pointing up the road behind us. Something about an armored personnel carrier going off the road, Holbrooke muttered. We looked behind us. Nothing. And then it hit us. They were talking about our armored personnel carrier. We got out and ran back to where the French drivers were pointing down the steep mountainside. Yes, there appeared to be some broken tree limbs. But was there a vehicle down there? What were we seeing? Our escort officer, a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel who'd picked us up in the Hummer and led the French vehicle, slipped down the mountainside to investigate and disappeared into the undergrowth. Then there was the sound of small arms fire and a muffled explosion or two from further down the mountainside. The French were mystified. Mines, they said, pointing down the mountainside. No one had communications, and Holbrook and I were frantic. That armored car had been filled with our team members. Finally, I could wait no longer. I started down the mountain. "Wait! Come back!" Holbrook called. At that moment, a Bosnian general appeared, but he spoke no English. Through my poor Russian and sign language, we learned that the road switched back. That meant if we kept going down the road, we would find the fallen vehicle from below. Holbrook and I took off on foot, running down the road, my Army green dress uniform coat flying. The Bosnian was right, and a mile or so further down the road it circled back in a horseshoe bend. We saw a cluster of halted vehicles. Someone spoke broken English, but no one could explain what had happened. I scrambled hand over hand up the steep mountainside and soon found a medic with a dead French soldier. "2 more, he pointed. "That's all." The dead soldier could have been from our vehicle, but I couldn't be sure. I slid back down to the road and saw a stretcher was being brought up from further below, bearing an American who was barely conscious, moaning in pain. Someone pointed down below where a column of greasy black smoke was rising. I just started running, breaking through the brush as I stumbled and fell down the mountainside. A couple of 100 meters down, I saw the vehicle, turned on its side and burning. A Bosnian fighter leaned against a tree nearby. "Stay away," he cautioned with his hands. But my men might be in that vehicle. I couldn't stay away. I used a log to pry open the hot metal door, and it was like looking into a furnace. 2 of our men were there, clearly dead, the flames licking only inches from their still faces. I looked around for something with which to put the fire out. I found nothing, so I ran back through the brush, scrambling up toward the road, hoping to find a fire extinguisher. Every soldier I'd ever lost, every accident I'd ever seen, every trace of guilt I'd ever felt, they all came back to me now. I'd have done anything to rescue those men. We put the fire out and recovered the bodies of Ambassador Bob Fraser and Colonel Nelson Drew. Then we combed the area and learned that 2 of our team had crawled out of the vehicle before it exploded. Dan Gerstein had survived by wedging himself into a corner as the vehicle flipped and rolled some 20 times coming down the mountain. He'd helped a massively injured but still alive Joe Cruzel get out of the vehicle, and both were taken to a hospital. Within hours, we learned that although Dan lived, Joe had died from his injuries. Joe, the Air Force Academy guy who jumped off that balcony with me. In so doing, we openly celebrated life, and now he was dead. It was a grievous loss. It was a serious setback. Holbrook and I returned to the States. We attended a memorial service at Fort Myer to commemorate our 3 colleagues. And after that, we received guidance from President Clinton. Build a new team. Go back. Get the job done. The guidance was clear and strongly delivered. Over the next 3 months, we did our best to follow the President's orders. Along the way, we met numerous times with each of the Serb, Croat, and Muslim leaders, as well as with a number of European diplomats. We took advantage of NATO airstrikes against the Serbs to gain a ceasefire and Serb withdrawal of heavy weapons from Sarajevo. We also worked to secure Russian support for the process and slowly crafted a draft agreement. The details would be hammered out in final form through direct talks among the parties and with our help at a secluded location, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. As Holbrook mused one day, "I don't know whether we're mediating or negotiating." It was true. Our role changed from time to time as we adapted to whatever it took to push the process forward, sometimes carrying messages between the parties, other times trying to talk them out of their views. At one point, I found myself arguing with U.S. Navy Admiral Leighton Smith on the need to resume airstrikes, and at another time negotiating with Milosevic to turn over captured French pilots. My role had changed too, as Holbrook brought me more tightly into the process. With help from Joint Staff colleagues, I prepared and negotiated the military annex for the agreement, drove the inclusion of a police annex, and with Jim Pardue, Joe Cruzel's replacement on the team, helped work the territorial division that separated the warring factions. At one point, I was in Moscow with Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot, pleading with the Russian Foreign Ministry. At another, I found myself delivering a late-night briefing to the assembled NATO ambassadors in Brussels. In the end, I arbitrated the final details on the map that would divide Bosnia. Holbrook and I and the others on our team had spent hundreds of hours arguing with some of the worst, most difficult people in the world, including indicted war criminals Radko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic, all the while weighing arguments, watching body language, and working to generate sufficient common interests to move each element of the diplomatic process forward. Eventually, we succeeded in winning the agreement of all parties. Like all diplomatic agreements, it was imperfect, and all parties had reservations, but the fighting stopped, and NATO troops entered Bosnia. As Holbrook once observed, diplomacy wasn't about finding final solutions. It was just about stopping the killing. This was what most of us hadn't understood, especially those from the military. We were looking for final solutions, unconditional surrender, or some similar formula. But reality's more complicated than that. The essential thing is to move from fighting with weapons to fighting with words. There would always be arguments. That, after all, was why there'd always be a need for diplomats. Along with Holbrook and the others, I spent the last 4 months working at the intersection of diplomacy and force. We spent a lot of time talking about the future of the Balkans with Milosevic. Serbia would be, he said, a small but reliable ally of the United States. Serbia would be one of the 7 gateways of Europe. Serbia would like the Balkans to have no national borders whatsoever. He was looking ahead, trying to work past the conflict. Some of it was a game he was playing with us. There was no doubt of that. But I also began to see that through changing people's minds and opening the door to an alternate vision of the future, you could gain strategic consent. In other words, their willing cooperation. As Milosevic warned, General Clark, do not have NATO become occupying power. Occupying powers do not do well here. It was a threat. He was comparing us to the World War II Nazis. And like all effective threats, it happened to be real. The key, he explained to us, was to treat people with respect. For all his evil, Milosevic was a keen observer of human nature and an astute practitioner of power diplomacy. This experience drew on all my military knowledge and leadership background. It confirmed all I'd studied of diplomacy. These were the principles of power politics among nations. But to work, it was clear, they had to be exercised through personal relationships. Ultimately, diplomacy wasn't about trade-offs so much as it was about persuasion. To succeed, you had to link the hard calculus of costs and benefits to charm, new opportunities, and the promise of a better tomorrow. Success was 90% persuasion, backed up by 10% coercion. Inside the administration, we finally completed the national security strategy of the United States, a national security strategy of engagement and enlargement. It was dutifully issued in February 1996, but received little of the fanfare required to offset the previous years of partisan criticism that seemed invariably to come from the party out of power. We would remain engaged in the world, supporting friends and those who shared our values. And if force was to be used, it was to be used only as a last resort, and even then, alongside allies, if possible. We also issued its national military strategy, companion piece, a strategy of flexible and selective engagement. We would maintain our strong nuclear deterrent and forward presence forces, and we would use our military as directed for peacekeeping or humanitarian purposes, though they would remain organized and prepared for war. And just a few weeks before I left, we published Joint Vision 2010, a key document in laying out how the armed forces would actually operate. It stressed high technology, modern communications, and precision strikes, all of which rolled together constituted much of the vision we took from the lessons of Operation Desert Storm. But we added to it the concept of full spectrum dominance, the need to prevail at any level of contest, from peacekeeping and hostage rescue to full-fledged warfare, which emphasized land forces and incorporated lessons from Somalia and Haiti. It proved a pity that the incoming Bush administration either neglected or discounted these ideas. They could have saved us much grief in Iraq. What we had done in practice was justify the idea that a robust military was essential in peacetime. We could use these military assets to build relationships, supplement or empower diplomacy, head off impending conflict, as well as going to war if we had to. It was a much more active form of deterrence than we'd had before. Some were calling it peacetime engagement or preventive diplomacy. Abroad, the effect of our actions was to reestablish America's leadership. At the end of the Cold War, as Europe sought integration, some people in France were working to reduce America's Cold War influence. By its initial abstention from the surging conflict in Yugoslavia, the United States had partially abdicated its leadership role in the world. President Clinton and his national security team took the lead again. The Dayton Peace Accords had demonstrated American competence as well. From this experience, I drew a lesson in leadership. Set the objectives and principles. Discuss, listen, and work to build consensus, which means to accept allied suggestions, but retain responsibility, and then make it happen. Each of our allies was rational and political. They had their own domestic concerns that impacted policy, just as we did. Successful leadership internationally required not America's dictation, but America's consensus building. It was the art of the possible, just like any politics. Forging consensus was about building relationships, listening and learning, handling people on their own terms, and taking risks, professional and personal, including physical risks. This was the meaning of international leadership in the post-Cold War world. The U.S. military had become the go-to agency of rapid response within the government. The combination of large in-place capabilities, worldwide communications, and ready financial resources that could be reallocated enhanced the Pentagon's stature far beyond its warfighting responsibilities. Other branches of the government had not been reformed to accommodate the implications of the new strategy. The State Department didn't create cadres of political developers, nor did Commerce discover how to create jobs overseas, nor did Health and Human Services take over the public health responsibilities of nations we were assisting, nor did Justice acquire the capabilities to implement legal reform, police, public security assessments, and training in advance of an operational deployment. All this was largely left to the military, or to pure dumb luck. By late 1995, it was clear that we were not succeeding in Haiti. It was one of the relative failures of the administration. We could restore a government and even organize elections, but we couldn't seem to heal a broken society, transform a social order, or create self-sustaining economic development. And when we intervened, we inevitably became responsible, not just for installing a new government, but for the enduring welfare of the whole society from which a functioning government should draw its support. That, unfortunately, was simply beyond our means, skill, and level of commitment. This limitation would become even more devastating as the Bush administration plunged into Iraq in 2003. As for the services, especially the Army, there was little patience with the practical aspects of these ideas. The Army had sharpened its focus on the warfighting mission alone. The engines of NTC and the Battle Command Training Program, along with the long shadows cast by the public adulation of General Norman Schwarzkopf and Operation Desert Storm, and the need to keep the force funded, seemed to obscure, for most Army leaders, the shape of things to come. Never mind the deployments to Rwanda, Haiti, and Bosnia. The Army didn't seem to accord these missions much respect. There was little emphasis on the cultural awareness or language skills that might be needed in the future, but a whole lot of emphasis on rebuilding the warrior spirit. Shawley saw the problem, observing that, quote, real men don't do mutwa, these military operations, other than war.